Hallo und herzlich willkommen zum CoronaTalk der IL, der Interventionistischen Linken. Ist heute die 7. Ausgabe. Titel ist "Die Pandemie kennt keine Grenzen". Und wir haben schon mal vor 2 Wochen mit europäischen Genossinnen darüber diskutiert, was die globale Perspektive auf die Corona-Krise ist. Und auch heute haben wir Gäste aus dem globalen Süden auch, und wir werden gleich nochmal ins Englische wechseln. Ihr kennt das vielleicht schon, ihr könnt auch Fragen stellen. Ihr könnt ja auch gerne auf Deutsch stellen, die wir dann aufnehmen können. Genau. Und ich bin Ilana von der IL, ich werde es heute moderieren. Okay, and in English, welcome to the Corona Talk of the Interventionist Left, the EL in Germany. It's our 7th episode. And it's the second one now on the international perspective. And 2 weeks ago, we spoke with comrades and friends from Europe about their perspective on the Corona crisis. And now we want to take a look beyond Europe, and we have very interesting guests that are going to introduce just now. Just a few words on today's episode. Corona is a global phenomena, and the virus doesn't stop at national borders. But in different places and in different countries, in different social contexts, the effects of Corona can vary very greatly. And we also know that diseases do not occur in a vacuum. There's the factor of the global political economy. It plays a role on how countries can respond to Corona, but also very specific national histories and contexts affect how we deal with Corona, and we want to shed some light on these differences. This also means that the answers and how we view and analyze Corona, they differ. Today, we hope to suss out with our guests from the radical left in different parts of the world, like how they view Corona, and maybe it can inspire some debate here in Europe. And having stressed that there are differences, we also today want to talk about the question whether there are common perspectives, connections, or possibilities for collaborations or projects. And yeah, we would like to hear from our international guests that are going to introduce now. I'm very, very happy for the 3 people who join us tonight. There's Daniel Fuchs. He's an activist from Vienna. He lives in Berlin now, and he's been following social developments and the development of social struggles in China for many, many years. Thanks for joining us tonight. And then we have Blandine Juchs, international activist in Colombia. She's involved in prison struggles, women movements, and she's working with rural communities. And Blandine, she's also a member of, excuse my bad Spanish, the Congreso de los Pueblos, and also the social and political network of social movements in Colombia, and the Red de Hermandad y Solidaridad. That are both structures that we as the EL have been working with, and we met some of them during our caravan of solidarity in Colombia in 2018, and we've been very close ever since. And then also we have Carla from South Africa. I'm very happy to have you. She's a feminist and historian from South Africa, and Carla has been researching the connection between social issues and health. And she's been especially looking at the HIV crisis, and I'm sure she can share some insight from that. And we have a different set of questions for tonight, but before we start, I'd really like, just very personally, how are you personally dealing with the special situation in Corona, like what it's like in your countries? For example, Carla, you have a hard lockdown in South Africa that obviously varies quite a bit to our restrictions we have in Germany. So maybe Carla, you want to share a bit what it's like.
Thank you very much, and thank you for having me here. So South Africa is in, I think, week 5 or 6 now of a lockdown. It started the 25th of March, and we've now moved to a system where there's going to be different levels of lockdown. So the kind of full hard lockdown is is level 5. We've now moved to level 4, which means there's 3 hours a day when people can go out for a walk or take exercise. Other than that, only essential services are functioning. And obviously the economic implications in a country where very many people are dependent on either income support or informal economic sectors has a quite significant implication. The experiences of the lockdown obviously deeply mediated by class and the kind of benefits that come with class positionality. So for middle class South Africans, it's not too terrible. People can order food online, it can be delivered. People can use the internet and download and watch things. But for people who are more vulnerably positioned in society, or for whom the state has less kind of respect of citizenship or rights, it's a very different experience. So we've seen situations where particularly informal settlement movements, despite legislation restricting completely the destruction of people's informal settlements or housing, has been ignored. And ongoing struggles that have been evident in cities like Durban and here in Cape Town and in Joburg have just been carried on and have in fact in some places got worse. We have it's kind of moved towards a militarization in the sense that the South African National Defence Force has now been put out onto the streets to ensure social distancing, and the lockdown restrictions are kind of enforced or are looked at. And for many South Africans, of course, despite the name change to the South African National Defence Force, in a pre-94 context in apartheid, the South African Defence Force was also used in certain areas to ensure laws were retained. So there is in some ways a weird echo of past restrictions, despite the context being different in many ways. So we know that there's been particular concerns around LGBTI safety and GBV and the impact specifically on women in abusive contexts. So yeah, there are, along with that, though, moments of solidarity and people coming together. So really how it is depends on what day it is, I think.
Yeah, thanks. Can imagine it's quite hard. And Blandine, what it's like in Colombia for you?
So we have a kind of pretty similar situation. Since March 19, we've been in a total lockdown. So we have the right women's on one day and men's on the other day to go out for groceries. Since in the past week, we had the right now to go out for 1 hour to walk or something between 6 a.m. and 10 a.m. So this is actually a good news in the context. But we have a pretty similar situation too in terms of what it means for people, right? When most of the population have informal work or need to go out to get some food on the table. So you can really see the class issues being like, like obvious, and you can feel it literally in your stomach. So the difference between, activists or people like me that actually, if you're asking me how I am, well, I'm pretty good. I have a house, I have roommates, I have collective networks and people I can rely on for dealing with the rent to be paid or things like that, even if we can't work. This is a totally different situation for people who don't have a house or who can't stay home for many reasons. For example, there's no food in the house. We also have the issue of, as many other parts of the world, of feminicide being happening, because it means like, being stuck home with someone who can eventually kill you in many cases for a lot of women. And we also have the issues of militarization in the territories in the midst of the armed conflict, and also the issues of prison that I guess we'll have more time to get into in the next minutes.
Thanks for sharing that. And Daniel, what is it like in China, but also what it's like for you? You're based in Berlin.
Hi, thanks for having me. Yeah, I mean, starting with what it's like here in Berlin, I really have to say, obviously, that and hearing also your experiences, that I'm in a very privileged position. Obviously, I mean, I work at university, so my private life has not been affected that much. I still have a job and I do online teaching, so this very personal level, obviously it's yeah, it's just a very privileged situation that one has to. That is much easier than many other people in Germany and obviously in many other parts of the world. Maybe one more personal comment, sort of my personal situation has nevertheless also been affected by the fact that my partner is Chinese, so and we have been sort of confronted with sort of our anxiety and our unease about the whole situation since the very beginning, if you like, or since January, getting constant sort of being in contact all the time with our family in China, and sort of yeah, trying to figure out how they are. And now it has actually shifted. So since a couple of weeks, they have been more worried about the situation here in Germany than in China. But maybe we come to that aspect later. So in general, the situation in China among sort of my friends, comrades, colleagues, and also family members is, I would say, I mean, very much characterized by relief, and also relief about having sort of beaten, if you like, at least the first wave of the virus. I think that's sort of the general public sentiment at the moment. Because the sort of lockdown measures have been lifted slowly already since the end of February, March, and even Wuhan. The lockdown in Wuhan has been lifted by now, and slowly things getting back to normal. So that's sort of, I think, if you look sort of from a very macro perspective on sort of a general sentiment among the people that we talk to, but then obviously, and I would say that sort of there are already obvious similarities to other cases that Carla and Blandine were already talking about. If you look at China, you also have to look at sort of the class dimensions of the crisis and how it has affected within China different people in different class positions. And I think that one aspect that is very often sort of overlooked is the specific situation of internal migrants in China, migrant workers in China. So we're talking about a group of approximately 290 million people, sort of the backbone, if you like, of the Chinese working class. And these workers are in the majority actually in informal employment relationships, and they were heavily affected and are still very much affected by the crisis. I read an article recently, for instance, that said that in total, the estimated losses of wages by migrant workers in China amount to almost 115 billion US dollars. So there were like significant wage losses in the months of sort of February and March. And in addition to that, a crucial sort of difficulty for internal migrants in China is that they do not have real access to a social safety net. So there is sort of a basic social insurance system in China, and it has actually been expanding in the past decade or so. But migrant workers who come from rural areas to the cities are very much excluded from it. So if you look at figures from the past couple of years, only 15% or so had access to medical insurance, around the same amount to health insurance, and a lot of those migrant workers do also not have access to unemployment insurance. So there's not only a loss of wages, but also loss of employment without any kind of insurance that they have access to.
Thank you. Thanks all three of you for sharing that and putting sort of the personal into a political perspective. Yeah, I think there are differences, but also similarities. And maybe we can move now to the question a little bit, the status quo. And Daniel, maybe it might be interesting if you can give us a little bit more detail and background that the virus had the first severe breakout in China, and the first few weeks the government was basically denying it, but then they have taken severe measurements to control the pandemic. And what does it actually mean for the Chinese society? Like, how did they deal with it? Maybe you can share some insight.
Yeah, of course. I guess to start with, I think when we look at sort of what the Chinese government, the central government did, and also how the crisis has been experienced in China, I think we can divide the past couple of months in roughly maybe 3 phases. The first phase sort of started at the end of December and lasted until the end of January, roughly, and that's sort of the period of time that you already mentioned, that was characterized by the fact that especially local governments, so the local government in Hubei province and the local government in the city of Wuhan, did play a rather significant role in sort of suppressing the flow of information on the virus, suppressing sort of citizens in China that sort of tried to talk more openly about the virus. And this is despite the fact that the Chinese government actually on the 31st of December did already formally inform the WHO about sort of the danger of the virus, right? But so there was the first couple of weeks in January where the local government sort of suppressed information and also denied, very crucially, that there is human-to-human transmission in this case. And this was only officially declared at the 20th of January. And after that, sort of the second phase, starting the second phase was very much defined by sort of the heavy lockdown and various other measures that the central Chinese government employed to fight the virus. So I think that if you have read media reports about China in recent months, that's what we heard about mostly. Maybe a little bit about what those measures involved. So, I mean, first of all, there was heavy lockdown measures on specific cities and regions of China, curfews that were sort of strictly implemented. First of all, the city of Wuhan was put under quarantine. Then sort of further cities and sort of basically the entire province of Hubei was also put under curfew. And there we speak about sort of 60 million people who were affected by these lockdown measures. And slowly those measures were then also extended to other parts of China. Some figures speak about a total of 230 million people in China, in urban China, that were at some point or in some form affected by those measures. So the lockdown was only one measure, however, I would say. So what the central government also used were various other things. They sort of mobilized the People's Army very much. So the People's Army was very heavily involved in sort of logistics targeted at Hubei and the city of Wuhan. They sort of substantively increased testing capacities also then since the end of January. They also sent a lot of doctors from other provinces to Hubei province, to Wuhan. So there was a variety of measures that were employed. And at the same time, what started at this period as well was that sort of contact tracing via apps was sort of introduced, first on a local basis via pilot projects. This is very often the case in China, that sort of state measures are first introduced on a pilot basis in one city, and then they are extended to the entire nation. And this lockdown phase sort of lasted roughly until the end of or end of February, I would say, and then slowly the lockdown was lifted again, and that would be the third phase. Again, very different in very different times in very different regions and cities. But in this third phase, the slowly lifting and the slow moving back to sort of a normal life, so to say, is what I would say also characterizes the situation at the moment. And here, these tracing apps do still play a very important role. So everyday life in China is very much defined still now by tracing apps that tell you whether you can access certain buildings, whether you can access public transport, where you can travel across sort of provincial borders and so forth. And sort of every Chinese citizen is basically affected by these apps that allow you or don't allow you to do certain things in daily life. So I think that's sort of a rough overview of what sort of happened in this period. And as I already said, I think now one of the defining sort of broader sentiments is that sort of the so-called people's war against the virus has been won. Since mid-March, I think there have hardly been any cases, according to official figures, of new infections from within China. But the only cases that have been detected are supposed to have come from outside of China. And so there's a very great sentiment of relief and also pride in the fact that China has beaten, the Chinese government has beaten the virus. I think that's sort of what defines the situation. But then obviously we could talk about the sort of the economic dimensions. There's still a there's very substantive implications with regards to economic activities that are still there today. The class dimensions that I mentioned earlier with regards to migrant workers is still are still a very substantive factor if we look at China today. And finally, also what I would like to highlight, sort of this pride has also sort of transformed into a rising form of a rising sentiment of nationalism in China. This comes on the one hand side sort of from the Chinese central government, obviously. So there's pride in the fact that the virus has been beaten. On the other hand, I think that sort of we have to look at the fact that since the beginning of the crisis in China, there has been, first of all, sort of a lot of Orientalist or even racist discourse against China. You know, sort of media in Europe and in the United States and everyone around the world basically was talking about the China virus. And there were very specific pictures of, or a specific form of talking about the measures in China. You know, at the beginning, how we talked and how the media was talking about the lockdown measures, sort of how could it be that must be sort of only an authoritarian state can do something to their people. You know, we're looking at specific forms of repression and so forth. And obviously these debates have been, they have been heard in China, right? So Chinese people, Chinese media have been reporting about those debates in Europe. And so this has an impact. And by now, I think in the last couple of weeks and months, what has also led to this, I would say, a bit increasingly dangerous level of nationalism in China is obviously, or are obviously the attacks by the US government and other European governments against China, right? So first we had kind of this orientalizing of China in dealing with the crisis. And now we have direct attacks about sort of China is responsible for the crisis. The US government, like Trump was even talking about sort of possible reparations that he or the US government will demand of China. And at the same time, if we look at the situation in the US, it's really tragic what is actually happening. And this is also in the media in China, and the Chinese government is obviously happy to sort of use this, or not happy to use, sorry, this is a wrong way to say it, but I mean, there is reports about this, and this also leads to, or fires up this sentiment of nationalism, because, you know, you have been criticizing us, but look at how you deal with the situation.
Thanks. This was a really great overview, and also about the different phases. And I guess we might come back later to that, how that actually changes social struggles in China. But now Blandine, I'd like to know from you how the crisis, the corona pandemic, is affecting Colombian society. There have been reports of murder of activists in rural areas during the lockdown, and also death during prison riots. And it might be interesting for people to explain a little bit why a lockdown makes it more dangerous for certain people. Maybe you can share a little bit of context to that.
Yeah, sure. Well, let's start with the prison issue, because this is one of the first issue that that was like national news here and so forth. So we started the lockdown on the March 19th. Visit to prisons were already suspended since March 12th. And on the March 21st, there was the first pacific protest of prisoners. They were basically banging pots or banging something to make noise about their situation, because we're talking about 124,000 prisoners with an overcrowding rate of 54%. So we're talking about a really dangerous situation. The UN has been making statements about that, and it's an obvious situation that the coronavirus in the prisons could be a disaster. The problem was that the guards in the Modelo prison of Bogota, despite the fact that there was repression in many other jails, but this is where a massacre occurred. So they actually opened fire on the prisoners, alleging that they were trying to escape, and killed 23 prisoners, and have another 80 prisoners that were injured. So that was a huge impact for the first day, and that did put the whole prisons issue, on the top of the headlines of the news, and that was an actual concern. So then there was a lot of pressure toward the government and other protests, so that the government would come out with some kind of decree, as we have seen in other countries of the world, of like massive humanitarian release of prisoners and so forth. That decree did just happen on April 15, but it's definitely not enough. It's actually just covering what the actual law is covering. It's just a kind of a decree to comply with the law, so that 4,000 prisoners could have house arrest instead of prison, which is actually things they should have the right to start with, according to Colombian law. And then it's not a solution to even like 4% of the overpopulated population of the jails. So we had a series of hunger strikes, protests, and in the midst of that, 2 weeks ago, the breaking news was coronavirus made it to one of Colombian jail. So you would have thought that you would stop transfer, right? And there was actually a decree saying that prisoners shouldn't be transferred unless from that prison that was already contaminated. But despite of that, the prisons in Bogota decided to receive prisoners from the Villavicencio prisons. So actually, this is a bad management of the guards and of the government of a situation that makes it really hard to deal with in prisons. So now officially there's around 400 cases in prisons, but we kind of know it's way more, and that has a lot of other impacts. I mean, it transforms some something that's already bad in many situations, which is jail time, in possibly death penalty in many cases, depending on the health situation. But it also suspend your trial, because your trial is supposed to be like online conferences, but obviously it doesn't work because the online hearing room is close to where the sick prisoners are, and this kind of issue, right? So the prison issue is an ongoing situation, and I'll take advantage of that situation to make the link with the social leader situation, because actually the old social leaders situation in Colombia has to do with criminalization of them, and that goes from being arrested to being killed, right? So this is the case of Julian Hill, one of the leaders of the People's Congress, who's currently in jail. And so part of those social leaders that are awaiting trial, it's been almost 2 years. And now that, that he was already condemned to jail for being a social leader before trial, but now it's a danger for his own life and many other prisoners. So the situation of social leaders, it got worse since the first days too. Some leaders from the People's Congress, Marco Revereña and Carlota from the women's movement, were assassinated in the first days, Well, basically, it's an issue of empty streets, right? You have empty streets, so it's even easier for right-wing paramilitaries or group links to the government or through their agenda, or some other armed group to actually act. Also, because it's isolation, right? So because you're isolated, it's harder to react, to protect yourself collectively, and so on. Also, there's that situation on the ground. Like, I mean, there's strong rural communities that are organized and that are trying to maintain the control on their territories and are not letting the army coming in, or trying not to. And they're not armed. They're just like, peasants, guards that are organized as civilians to protect their territories. And for example, on the 29th, a few days ago at night in Arauca city, that I think actually IL went when the delegation came here, they were shot by the army, right? Because the army is strongly disagreeing with the fact that actually, people take care of their own safety. So you have those two, like, so you have a prison issue, you have a militarization issue, which also goes with the fact that so military do not respect their own way the community protect themselves. And sometimes they actually put them in danger, because actually they act as if soldiers could not get the coronavirus, but they're actually a great vector for the virus to actually be spread around the country. And the military, the Colombian military, also took advantage of one of the guerrilla ceasefire. The ELN responded to the UN call and made a ceasefire. And actually the militaries took advantage of that situation to actually control more territories. They also took advantage of the pandemic to go forward with their plan of forced eradication of cocoa leaf crops. This is a huge issue that we belong to explain, but basically, peasants that have been involved in cocoa leaf crops have been asking and negotiating with the government, and it's part of the peace process with the FARC guerrilla too, that they're supposed to have the programs so that you can make a transition from these illegal crops to grow food. But the government hasn't been responding. So now you have militaries going around countryside, eradicating coca leaf, who could be one of the few things that people could get money from in a situation of pandemic and anger and so forth. So conflict arose around that, and actually some peasants protested against the eradication of their crops and were actually shot dead by the militaries. So this is this is part of the main issue, like the fact that the war doesn't stop. And so this is about the countryside, but inside, like in the cities too, we have a situation where you have victims of armed conflict, poor people from neighborhood that sometimes go to the street and make blockade to be like, we don't have any food, we don't have any money, like do something about that. And then riot cops are sent, right, instead of food. So this is the militarization. The militarization goes in the rural areas with a really harsh situation for social leaders that are trying to keep the army out, and also in the cities and urban areas.
Thanks for the great overview. It sounds like that actually the social disparities and problems are like deepening with the corona crisis. We'll come back to that later. I'd like to ask Carla now. South Africa has a very long experience with dealing with pandemics and diseases due to the HIV crisis, and you've done a lot of research on that. Maybe you can give us some insight, like what is maybe similar to the HIV crisis and government responses, but also what is not, how it differs, and what's the specific South African context for that?
Thanks. I think this is the thing. This pandemic is new for many of us, but in 1918, the global pandemic that was, interestingly, the Spanish flu, which of course was not at all from Spain, was a similar global wake-up call in some ways to a society that was in the midst of a global war, was moving vast quantities of people around. So we have, and before that, you track back to the plague, we've had pandemics pretty much in almost all our existence as standing upright humans. What has been interesting in the sort of globalization, the era of a very specific sort of globalization, neoliberalism, has been the interplay between the socioeconomic and global interactions and what goes on the ground in many ways. Some of the things that are obviously similar are issues of the ways in which global xenophobia, political dominance, or fights for political dominance deploy very easily kind of existing stereotypes. So influenza epidemic, Spanish flu, in the context now, China and the Chinese flu, and it's a more regular thing. It's the Asian flus in the HIV context in South Africa, and it's not particularly unique. There were variations of this globally. The idea is initially of that there were outside infected others, so somebody outside there, either a certain type of body or a certain type of practice, that could very easily be blamed. And so a lack of response, a lack of engagement could be pretty much gotten away with by just saying, well, it's not us, it's not happening to us. So the creation of an outsider other group that is the infected other is a fairly consistent narrative in most health crisis situations. So you see examples, for example, in South Africa, of the arrivals of smallpox, for example, epidemics coming in on ships that were coming to take slaves and to bring in goods from overseas, but the outbreak being blamed on slaves and women who did laundry for the ships, on the ships. So there's always this very interesting dynamic of what is going on in a health crisis and how the situation is being presented, what the narrative of the health crisis is, and who's being given particular responsibilities. So we see always the class dimension, there's often a gender dimension, and then in countries that have very complicated kind of racial identity politics, that plays out as well. In terms of things that are similar or different, the most obvious difference is mechanism of infection. So that's the thing that usually will always indicate or shape a lot of how a pandemic is engaged. So with HIV and AIDS, it was about sex. And of course, people don't talk about sex. It's the morality and the horror of addressing passion, or, the potential of the penis and the vulva freaks out a lot of people. So to just talk through something that is sexually transmitted has a very large impact. And you see that in any STI kind of moment, or any kind of STI infection in a public space. So our most obvious difference is that corona is not spread sexually. So the dynamics and morality that can more easily be brought into play when a transmission happens through sexual relation is not there. Having said that, the thing that remains the same is the idea that an outside infected other brings it. So I was kind of interested, Daniel, in the notions of how infection, where it comes from, because a lot of the narrative here has been about the infections from outside, and then what are now being referred to as community infections. And of course, in South Africa, the initial infections came from people who had the money to go and travel overseas, which has also been fascinating. For once, it didn't start in Africa. I mean, I'm sure at some point it's going to be, it'll come back down to everything coming from Africa. But it's been fascinating, because usually the narratives around AIDS came, there's this idea of the dark continent and where infection comes from. And so that was very interesting, because a lot of the early discussion was like, well, it's only people who live in suburbs where people have money to go travel that need to worry, because for the rest of the country, like, this is not a reality. Of course, what became evident and very clearly revealed was the interdependencies of people in an unequal society. So some of the first infections happened because employers of domestic workers who'd been overseas, caught corona outside, come in, had insisted on domestic workers coming in to carry on, providing housekeeping services, and then domestic workers had to go back home without the access to the same kind of medical engagements, the same kind of social support. And so suddenly we had, then everything started being about how many community infections were there. So internal infections rather than those that came from outside the country. So those similarities of trying to border or in some ways set some sort of boundaries from where infection comes, inside, outside, whether that's groups of people or physically land masses, is an ongoing similarity. The other thing that's been interesting is the way in which the health crisis has built on a long history of organizing for access to health. And that's been, so there's been this interesting thing that there are existing mechanisms of organizing that have been either reimagined or reinvigorated or rearticulated. So the kind of mass mobilization for access to antiretrovirals, which started taking place in the kind of late 90s in South Africa, built on what were existing anti-apartheid struggle kind of organizing and activist mechanisms. But before that, in the times when the first cases were identified in the early 80s, you still saw people using existing networks, whether they were around identity politics or sexuality politics or anti-apartheid politics, to try and pull together some sort of response. So that's been an interesting echo that's carried through between the epidemics. What, of course, has been completely different is the fact that this epidemic is happening in what is ostensibly a democratic country where people can now vote, as opposed to the start of the AIDS epidemic, which was, in apartheid and at the cusp of a transitional political space. The response from the government under our current president has been completely different to what we saw under our previous president, and a kind of essentially denialist position that HIV did not cause AIDS, that there was nothing, people didn't need to be supported for this process. So that hasn't happened, and that's been one of the most significant and important things. What's also been interesting is that a lot of the people who are now on what is referred to as the COVID Council, so there's a kind of special committee, are exactly people who were involved in that early epidemic. So the main spokesperson, who's kind of the chair who reports to the president, is somebody called Professor Slim Abdul Karim, and him and his wife Qureisha Abdul Karim were amongst the medical professionals who helped write the first national AIDS plan for South Africa in the democratic dispensation. So there are these very clear links of people having involvements and connections that go back to a pre-apartheid moment, or a kind of history of moving towards social transition, who of course are now implicated in a different way because they are informal government structures, but also playing out in how the response is happening. So that's been a very interesting thing, the move from trying to work out what lockdown should look like, then to the emphasis on testing. And interestingly, a really clear highlighting of community health workers. So South Africa has, like a couple of other countries in South America, large volumes of community health workers. So these are generally women, they're generally very poorly paid, and they in a particular area will check in on people's health, they do kind of health promotion, they'll assist people with particular things. Community health workers are now being kind of evoked in this really masculinist narrative of the war. It's because it's perpetually a war. Diseases, there must always be the war, which only ever has a win or lose, and is a very particular framing of engagement, who are now being called to be part of responses to that. So we've seen much more clarity in terms of information being provided to the public than we did under HIV and AIDS. We've seen more coherence in terms of even political parties that usually struggle to sit in the same room together, actually kind of mostly toning down and not making political issue out of responses, which is almost unheard of. So that's been significantly different. What's been significantly similar, of course, is always the connection to capital. So mining remains considered an essential service. We've taken out a vast amount of loans from the IMF, from various organizations. Our relationship with China, though, interestingly, is quite different from that of the US and UK, because South Africa, as part of the BRICS nation, there's a lot of close collaboration in terms of things like massive infrastructure projects. So there's a very particular economic relationship that plays out with China. So we've seen occasions where the president has specifically referred to assistance and support from China in a very positive manner. So there are those very kind of overarching similarities, and we saw that to a degree in the HIV, the struggle with HIV and AIDS, was that it was eventually when Big Pharma could be kind of brought to heel, that government sort of caved and things resolved themselves. So those connections are still evident historically across time and space. So I think, similarities also of fear and stigma. So we know people like Gugu Dlamini in 1998 was murdered by her community because she declared her HIV status publicly. We've had situations here where there's been discussions in the media about, do you give the names of people, especially at the beginning of the epidemic, do you declare the names of people who are testing positive? Or do you only say when it's Boris Johnson because he's like famous and a political leader? So then do you only say that only the famous are worthy of being recognized? And of course, that's also the completely context specific, because much as a lot of discussion has been had about not generating stigma, and one of the ways to not generate stigma is to be open to declare. And you've had situations where, for example, one of the first deaths in the Boerkaap, which is a suburb in the city, near the city, was that the family who lost a father, they put a statement out to the whole community. They announced his death. They announced it would have to change because the funeral rites obviously had to change. They declared he died of COVID because their position was that people should know it's nothing to be ashamed of, and people need to be aware that there is infection in the area. But there have also been cases of particularly, for example, domestic workers being absolutely adamant that they, even where they lived, could not be made public because they were concerned for their children's safety in schools. They were concerned for their own safety. So there are those specific contexts and stigma and how they do or don't play out that is also paralleled across these epidemics. There's much more, but I think that's more than my time on this question.
Thank you very much. It's all really, really interesting, the insights you share from your countries, and some of you already touched on the global dimension of injustices and North-South relations, or between China and the US. And I'd like to know from all of you, maybe in your own view, what are the marked global injustices during the Corona pandemic, and how they are maybe exacerbated. Maybe you, Daniel, you already said something, the relationship between China and the US, the one blaming the other, then talking about reparations. Can you say a little bit more about, the global dimension of that? You still on mute?
Can you hear me? Yeah. I think that sort of the global dimension does not. I think one of the aspects that I mentioned earlier is sort of this. You can call it a propaganda war between sort of states and governments in the US, but not only there. I would also say sort of that extends to the increasingly confrontative approach by governments in Europe towards China. I think this is one aspect. I think another, and this is a very important aspect, I think if we later talk about sort of what we can do as sort of activists or sort of those involved with sort of people in local struggles in China and other parts of the world, I think sort of to find a position that deals with sort of this increasingly dangerous confrontation between China or the Chinese government and governments in the West is sort of something that we have to face, and something we have to think about what we can do in this level. I think sort of the other aspect, obviously, how sort of globally China is affected sort of by the global dimension of the crisis is very much economically. So already earlier I said that despite sort of the lifting of the lockdown, and sort of despite the sort of this general positive outlook at the moment in China, sort of the economic implications of the crisis have been very significant. So just to give you some figures that I wanted to mention earlier, just to get sort of an idea of the extent, right? So in February, for example, the revenue in the retail sector was down by more than 20% compared to the period before. Industrial production in February was down by 14% compared to the year before. 85% of small and medium enterprises in a survey conducted by Chinese universities said in February that they only have financial reserves for 2 months, and if the economy doesn't pick up, that will be sort of that will be their financial, that will be their end basically. They would have to stop. So I think sort of those were all economic sort of impacts of the crisis that we've already seen in February and March, right? So I was giving these figures, but I think the global dimension will start to hit slowly now as demand in the US and demand in Europe for sort of export products produced in China is falling and is slacking. And this again has then impact on the unemployment rate of Chinese among Chinese workers, especially among the migrant workers that I mentioned before. And I think sort of this has the potential to sort of further increase social inequalities within China as well. Yeah. Thank you.
And Blandine, from your perspective, if you'd say global injustices, North-South relations, I mean, eyes are very often on Colombia in terms of the peace process or the war, but yeah, maybe you can give some insight as well.
Yeah, sure. Well, it's hard to answer this question without starting with hot news from today. There's actually military activities and intent of invasion or coup in Venezuela. So this is this is one of the main issue regionally. There's an ongoing tension. The US has been tension to overthrow the government of Maduro. It's been a while. They've been trying in many ways. They haven't been able to make it. So kind of they say, oh, global pandemic, great moment to go forward with that, right? So this is when we have the amazing declaration of Trump putting Maduro on the list of drug trafficker internationally. It's like pretty ridiculous, but the pandemic, doesn't stop war at all. What we can see in several parts of the world is that actually it's a good pretext to, and everybody's busy with something else too. So I mean, it's a good moment to go forward with that. So there's a huge, we've seen movements of troops around the border, Colombia and Venezuela since the beginning of the pandemic. Today there was incursion in the water of Venezuela, and there's movement on the Brazilian border too. So this is a huge regional issue, but that could have a global impact. Actually, I knew something big was going to happen. I didn't know it was a global pandemic a few months ago. I thought the war with Venezuela would be the first, but it seemed the pandemic won the race. But it doesn't mean that that actually, imperialism have no problem with pushing forward global war on the top of extreme inequalities, poverty, and global pandemic. So that would be a disaster. But this is something that's happening. I must also mention Cuba, because this is a huge issue here. I mean, like Cuba in Colombia has been giving places for students to learn medicine. He's been sending doctors to all Latin America and all the world for so many years. I mean, from South Africans' history to everybody's history have a relation to Cuba in terms of people's liberation. And seeing the Colombian government being so harsh on Cuba, not even receiving the doctors, not even receiving some basic advice from the health sectors, and trying to condemn them because for local history, Cuba has been helping out with the peace process, the FARC one, and now the ELN one. And it's been more than a year that the Colombian government, disrespecting all international agreement they had, actually decided to treat Cuba as a terrorist state, or protecting terrorists, or all that kind of war on terror vocabulary and so on. So I think those are the main elements in terms of global geopolitics from Colombia. But I would like to add that actually, and I guess we'll have more time in the next questions, but it's the whole how that put all of us in terms of global struggle in a different moment, in terms of like we're in really similar situation. We were a month ago or 2 months ago, but it's just more obvious to everybody right now. So that puts a lot of responsibility in terms of what to do now.
Thanks. And Carla, you already mentioned the mining, and I guess mining in South Africa is not just for domestic industries. And you also mentioned already loans to the IMF. Can you just give a few insights on that too from a South African perspective?
Absolutely. And to go, I mean, the mining industry, of course, is intimately related to migrant labor and the migrant labor system. And we're also having a context where, so mines are operating technically at 50%, and now there's going to be social distancing in mining. I mean, the notion kind of it sounds a bit science fiction, so, but let's see what that looks like. And of course, there's implications because we also have a large number of people who come to South Africa for job prospects. So the regional tensions and the pretext of, borders, new walls being put up at borders where, if the border's too big, I mean, nobody's ever going to actually wall it, but that points of the flow of people between South Africa and the rest of the continent is an issue. And because South Africa's economy is so intimately tied to very specific countries, particularly through mine labor, there are knock-on implications that way. So there's this interesting thing that there's South Africa's position on the continent and also what is or is not being done in other parts of the continent. So the AU is putting out statements every now and again, but countries are having quite different engagement with the epidemic across the continent. And of course, this is a continent, as many continents are, but there is a lot of movement of people. So how that's going to have an impact and what that's going to look like in the next little while is going to be interesting. Then we have this tension also because of our reliance on aid and donations between the tensions that are going on between the US and China. So we have, kind of on one hand, we're in bed with China for all sorts of things, but we also get a large amount, for example, of PEPFAR funding, which funds some of the largest rollouts for all our ARV programs. So there's always the tension of if something kicks off here, what does that mean about, because of our dependence on hard currency, what does that mean for the rollout of healthcare provision in South Africa? And then we have another interesting context, as you say, indeed, Blandine, the Cuba, South Africa and Cuba has this long relationship of sharing doctors. So Cuban doctors recently arrived here. Usually every year I work in the Faculty of Health Sciences and we send students out to Cuba, and there's the Cuban South African doctors exchange. So there's this interesting kind of multi-layered context of relationships that were forged by many of the people who are now in power when they were as part of a liberation struggle, and the tensions of that with many of the same people who are now managing essentially very capitalist neoliberal economies. So those intricacies are quite interesting. The other thing, of course, is that South Africa's credit rating was downgraded to junk status at the beginning of the epidemic, which was just, it was just ugly, malicious, and hideous. And of course, that has huge implications because it's impacted how we're able to, what loans we can negotiate. So if we're going to keep the system, and we're all going to have to be responsible for it, it essentially reinforces the kind of 1970s structural adjustment process all over again, except with the added benefit that I'll contain my language, but people out there get to make decisions about the economic status of your country in a context where there's often 70% unemployment. So it's just being fucked over doubly. It's so that those dynamics. Interestingly, though, what has been quite interesting to watch is that the narrative of the necessity for food sovereignty and for things like not being dependent on external deliveries of PEP for protective equipment, personal protective PPE, personal protective equipment, has seen a very interesting rise in kind of small scale production. So people are like, well, kind of, there's no masks, we'll make our own, which has been a very interesting response in a country whose textile industry, for example, was completely eradicated because of cheap imports. So that's, I mean, it's a very small nascent thing, but it's interesting. It's interesting to see a response to people saying, well, you know, supermarkets, you can support supermarkets, or you can support small scale farmers and have food parcels delivered directly from farmers to households that need food. So you have, you know, fairly organized, coherent government response on one level. Then you have this dynamic of the you know, the global economics. And then there's this also very interesting stuff happening between people. And that's been perhaps one of the most interesting aspects of it, of what's coming out. But yeah, the implications, I mean, it's similar to what you're talking about, Danielle, in terms of loss. You know, for example, Cape Town, where I live, one of the primary industries here is tourism. It's like it employs a vast number of people. It brings huge amounts of money into the city. Not so much. It's like now that's gone. So those effects are having an implication. So yeah, it's these complex dynamics are going to play out in all sorts of ways, and it's going to be interesting to see if those, or how those international spats continue to have these knock-on effects, or if there's going to be something like there was in 2000 when there was the push of the Jubilee campaign and others to say, actually, you know, we're just going to say no to your debt. I mean, it didn't work, but I kind of wonder, might this be the point where we say, actually, thank you for your loan, but we're tired of, you know, the extractive capacity that's been going on. And just a last comment in terms of, you know, what happens when people are focused elsewhere or just trying to survive. I mean, there have been very interesting things. So we had a plane, obviously international air travel apart from aid is now restricted, but we've had situations where planes have come into the country ostensibly with aid, and they've brought masks, etc., and then they've left with weapons. Shipments. So we're meeting our requirements from our major producers. We're meeting our requirements to ship out guns, and of course that's technically not in the legislation. That's technically not an essential service. So there's odd stuff going through, like local municipalities in enhancing bylaws that allow kind of fines for homeless people. So there's a whole layer of stuff, a whole series of things happening at different points, and it's difficult to keep, you know, you can't keep an eye on all of it all the time, which is why I think it's so necessary that we should have increased solidarity so that people can watch all the sectors and make sure that, you know, there's information shared.
Thank you, Carla. You already moved on to sort of, you know, like what could be a response, like just cancel debt. I think it's amazing. And I'd like to, with the last question, maybe to look at responses by the radical left. Like, in your opinion, would you say, in what's the current situation? Is there in Germany, we have an intense debate whether there's a window of opportunity for social change, whether the situation is totally open or whether it's just really shitty. And I'd like to know from you, what's the response from a radical left perspective in your country? Blandine, you were talking about rural communities and prison struggles. What are the responses in Colombia? Where do you see your fights? Where do you can win, actually?
Well, I'm not sure about winning yet, but let's go with some ideas. So after a first moment of shock, I guess everybody was in a state of shock the first days of like, what the hell, you know, like everything just changed. Because usually we have to spend as leftists most of our days trying to convince people that everything can change fast, and now it's done, but not by us, unfortunately. So the first thing is like usual reflex in terms of turning toward mutual aid, you know, like getting food together, putting like, you know, money together, the little that we have, so that people can pay rent, get some food on the table, and so forth. So this is a huge issue. Obviously, too many live Facebook and online activism in terms of what I would call the ideological are part of trying to raise awareness, to debate, to even understand ourselves what the hell has been happening. There was a few of protests, like the health sector, obviously for obvious reason, privatized for the past 30 years, a total disaster. They've been protesting actually physically families of prisoners too have been protesting around the jail. So it's been, you know, like try to create space to like go back to the streets with all the risks in terms of virus and police that it includes. And also what I was talking about, the, you know, the territorial control, and what we have here is what we call a popular power, in terms of like community being their own power in their territories. So like this is the kind of, you know, network structures, organized structures that exist and that need to play their part in that moment. So it's not anything great and new, but maybe a huge challenge is what I was saying, is that difference between who can be in the street and who is in lockdown in their house, who have to be in the street, and who's being locked down. So we have to navigate that thing. I think it's actually an opportunity for the left, and I'll be honest with some self-critique on those issues. I think that the pandemic is an opportunity. It's an opportunity for change. I'm not saying progressist, I'm not saying socialism, and I'm not saying fascism, but all that is possible, and all the gray in between, right? So a lot depends on what we're going to do. But I'll also see that there's an opportunity for the left to maybe overcome some of the bad habits we have had for so many years, in terms of trying to have a recipe of trying to want to control social change, having the recipe of, you know, like May 1st, March. I missed it too, but you know, like what are we always doing? And now we have to rethink totally what we're going to have to do. So maybe it's, you know, it can be the virus could be a good opportunity for a healthier relation between practice and theory, and actually use the methods and the concept we always write beautifully in books, but do not apply so much in life, because right now we don't have the recipe for social change. We don't have we don't have a party who's going to do the revolution. We don't have we have people with hunger. We have a lot of opportunity for social change, but we need to rethink and to be listening actually to other ways of organizing that have been happening. Actually, all Latin America, we were in the midst of intense struggle and intense protest and general strikes right when the pandemic and the lockdown hits. So like, you know, how do we see those movements transforming into network of mutual aid? How do we see that change into popular power in terms of like being your self-government in your neighborhood and in your communities, right? So this is the kind of lines I see. I don't see it easy, and I don't think it's a winning situation soon. But actually, for some people, even if it's terrible, even if I think we're all sad about many things happening and have people in really bad situation around us. But it's a kind of relief for some people to see that actually we have a role to play right now. We don't know which, but we have to work on it right now.
Thank you. And Daniel, in your point of view, like, what is the perspective of political activism in China? I mean, Chinese social movements, they face a lot of repression, but like more on a positive note, like what's the space for social change right now? Like, yeah, uplifting.
I don't know if I can give you a really uplifting message. Maybe then someone else should say something uplifting at the end. I'm not very optimistic, to be honest, when it comes to radical left perspectives or social activism in general. But maybe it's not going to be too depressive. I would like to basically to answer the question by first saying something about the general context. I guess that most of you will know it anyways, but sort of, I think if we compare the situation to sort of South Africa, for instance, or Colombia, we have sort of, there are some substantive structural differences in the ways in which social activism can actually occur in China, right? So, I mean, first of all, to start with, to tell you a little bit of the context, it has been very often overlooked, and that's maybe an uplifting point, if you like, that sort of various forms of protest movements, specifically strikes and other forms of labor protests, have been rising rather dramatically, sort of in the last since the beginning of the 2000s, mainly. So if we look at more recent figures, for instance, there have been almost, and these are just estimates, very low estimates, around 1,000 and more than 1,000 strikes per year, or other forms of labor unrest per year in China. So there are sort of a lot of strikes, or there have been a lot of strikes in recent years by Chinese workers, specifically migrant workers. We have also seen protest movements in other fields with regards to environmental protests, for instance. Feminist activists or activists in the LGBTQ movement have been organizing and experimented with new forms of activism since the beginning of, or since in the last decade, basically since 2010 or so. So there has been sort of a vibrant, or there has been an increase in protests and a diversification of different social actors who have been involved in forms of organizing. That's the context on the one hand, but on the other hand, sort of it has to be clear that when we talk about China, that all sort of those protests, these incidents of protests cannot rely on any form of stable political organization. So for instance, in China, there's only one trade union, the All China Federation of Trade Unions, which is a party organization. It's part of the Chinese Communist Party, and without or outside of the SCFDU, no other form of stable organization is allowed. So this would be the case for worker struggles. If we talk about feminist organizations, feminists have been mainly organized in the context of NGOs or other social organizations. But again, if you would have been not able to sort of have a more stable form of organization that puts forward any form of public protest, for instance. Yeah. So activists in China cannot really rely on any stable organization. And a lot of things are happening sort of with loose networks underground. So that's the broader context. The difficulty that sort of activists in China are confronted now with is that repression has increased even prior to the pandemic in China. So since Xi Jinping took over the leadership of the Communist Party in 2012, repression against NGOs, for instance, has increased. So a lot of NGOs were involved in forms of collective bargaining, for instance, had to dissolve or were forced to dissolve or look for other things they could do. There were attacks against feminist organizations, feminist NGOs. So since that period of time, since 2012, we have seen sort of a wave or several waves of crackdowns against such organizations. Another aspect of the repression in recent years has been the repression against sort of actual strikes. People who, me and other people who study or who do also research on strikes in China, talk about an increasing criminalization of strikes. That means that an increasing amount of strikes are dealt with by sending riot police or police forces to dissolve them, and that had also a very sort of harming effect on sort of potential worker activists who sort of emerged out of this context. So this is sort of the general context in which this crisis sort of actually evolved, which is on the one hand side, yes, you have an increasing amount of social struggles in China, but on the other hand, you also have sort of a much more, in recent years, a much more coercive approach by the Chinese state, and spaces for activists have become smaller and smaller. And this can also be seen during the crisis. So just to give you one example, some activists in various cities have just got together and organized masks. So they privately organized sort of bought masks and organized the sort of distribution of them in several cities outside of party and government structures. Repression was also then targeted against those organizations. Yeah. So even though this is not something that we would think of as very sort of as a sensitive issue, even doing that outside the party and government structures was enough for repression to set in. This has also affected in recent weeks comrades, for instance, in Beijing in February, a rather prominent Chinese feminist activist who was also involved in those mutual aid activities has disappeared, has been taken away by the police. Last week, 2 more activists have disappeared in Beijing. So this repression sort of is increasing, and this is definitely a problem. And so this is why my outlook is not that good. Maybe at the very end, to add something that gives us a brighter outlook is that despite repression prior to the pandemic and during the pandemic, it is definitely not the case that social struggles have vanished. Right. So if we look at what has happened since February in China, we have seen quite a number of protests in the service industry, in the transport industry, 2 sort of sectors that were affected by the lockdown very immediately. So the transport sector, in the transport sector, it was mostly cab drivers, for instance, who went on strike because they had to still pay fees for their cabs, but obviously there was no work anymore, so they started to go on strike. But also in the service sector, strikes because of layoffs increased. So there have been strikes in China in various sectors, but there has also been this sort of increasing form of repressions that activists have to deal with. One last point, maybe, I think that we will have to wait a little bit further how sort of the situation in China evolves when it comes to sort of the getting back to normal of industrial production, basically, because what is rather absent so far are strikes by industrial workers. They have been made up a very large number in recent years, but so far I personally don't know of many examples of recent strikes because of, for example, lower wages or other forms in which workers were affected. So I think this is something that we will have to wait and see how it develops. One thing to really end from my side here, one thing I think that is really important in that case for sort of connect for activists in different countries is that we try and sort of share experiences and connect sort of with each other across various countries. I think especially in the case of China, there is a general interest in China, but there is sort of a language barrier for many people, and a lot of people are sort of unaware what is going on in China. And in this situation, we are dealing with what we have referred to earlier, with sort of a geopolitically increasingly dangerous situation, sort of the pitting against each other of China versus the US or China and Europe. And I think we should try to bring sort of activists together. I think that's something that sort of we can, and I'm also speaking obviously as a sort of a white guy sitting in Berlin talking about what's going on in China, right? So, and if sort of we think about what we can do in this case, I think we should try to enable forms of or ways of communicating between each other so that we can develop a perspective on the crisis and on the future that is neither relying on sort of the perspective of sort of the central government in China, nor is it relying on sort of, you know, the discourse that is going on in the US or among European governments at the moment. This is very broad, sorry, but I think this is something that we can do on a very specific local level.
No, thank you. That's already touching on something I'll come to after that, the level we should fight on. And Carla, quickly the question to you as well, like what's the response from the radical left? And now South Africa is a very vibrant civil society and you have experience in overcoming colonialism and apartheid. But yeah, what's the progressive radical left agenda in South Africa?
Okay, so you know we love a protest more than almost anything. So I think it's dangerous to speak of the radical left as if it's a concrete, coherent thing. So that's the first thing I think we need to be very clear about. So to as an example of when I'm having a good day and I'm having the hopeful moments about what this might bring, because it swings quite severely between that and it's time for a kind of Margaret Atwood, Mad Adam, Year of the Flood type moment. So between those two extremes. Right before the lockdown, one of the things that happened was a socially distanced protest outside the City Hall in Cape Town from members of the Social Justice Coalition, which is a long-established kind of organization, saying, how can you put out public health messaging saying that people must wash their hands for 20 seconds when people don't have water? Like, this makes no sense. So you're saying the one thing that we must do to stop this virus is the thing that people can't do. And so there's been interesting moments where there's been leverage because of the particular context of the virus. So now suddenly, where for the last 20 years, it's been impossible to get JoJo's, the very large rainwater tanks, that they're called JoJo's because it was a brand, to get JoJo's delivered to places or to have, at least temporary water put in. Suddenly, JoJo's are being delivered right, left, and center. Water's being delivered. Okay, so that's been a very interesting moment. The other thing that's been very, very interesting is that there's been leverage for some of the existing struggles that people have been told are impossible to do, are now being done in a smaller way, but showing that it isn't impossible. So, for example, one of the more moderate organizations, the Black Sash, which has been around for years and years and has its origins as an anti-apartheid movement, has been fighting for years and years that there needs to be a basic income grant, which they call the 19 to 59 grant. So if you're younger than 18 in South Africa, you could technically get maybe a child grant, or your carer could get a child support grant. If you're over 60 and technically a pensioner, you are eligible for a pension. But between that time, there's no support. Okay, there's no financial support. So there's been a long-standing campaign to make a basic income grant that everybody is eligible for available. The whole time we've been told this is not happening, this is impossible. Now, it hasn't happened, but what has happened is that there's been an increase in some of the child support, which we know has a much bigger impact than just on a family. So a child support grant will generally support the child, but a much larger group of people living in a household. The other thing that's happened is they've declared what's been referred to as the COVID, it's like a COVID fund application. This is to stave off the most extreme poverty. So to give you a context of what that means, a large number, several million people will now be eligible to receive 350 Rand a month. So that's 17 euro. So there will now be access to 17 euro to try and prevent people starving to death. Okay, along with a rollout of food parcels and so forth. So this is something that's been, that like for the longest time, no, we can't do this. It's impossible. We can't do this. Turns out we can kind of do it. So there's a precedent now. Now, what that means after COVID is a whole other question, but there is now a precedent. Other things that have been interesting, so the existing organizations, specifically newer collectives like the Shais Fuba, which means to beat your heart, which is a feminist collective representing feminists and women and gender non-binary people, put together what was called a love letter to South Africa, or a love letter to women. And the essence of the love letter is one of radical care and kindness, and an act of restating of an intention to have a world where, rather than default, radical care and kindness might change social spaces. Now, that doesn't help when somebody's pointing a gun at your face. I'm not saying it does. But what the intention has spoken to is an idea of collectively engaging. And that group has not just done that. They've also been part of a much bigger coalition called the COVID-19 Coalition, which brought together, like, NGOs. They usually often struggle to sit in a room together sometimes, okay, because the politics of, the politics. Sending representatives to say, here's what people are doing in different sectors. Here's what we think needs to happen in terms, this needs to be heard by the COVID Council that's advising the president. The successes have been, there have been good days and bad days, but it brought together groups of people that haven't. On an individual level, sorry, I think this kind of takes to our next question. What has been fascinating is a reinvigorating of existing networks, but also something that doesn't happen here a lot is support across communities. So there's been they're kind of an idea that was around previously, but they've been reimagined now. It's a thing called a Community Action Network, CANS. And what CANS initially started out with were like people in a suburb saying, okay, this is what we need. Okay. And then so people gave money and they distributed food. Then there was a moment where richer, wealthier suburbs, so like Sea Point where I live, which is, affluent and very comfortable, started partnering with CANS in less resourced areas. So Gugulethu, for example, Khayelitsha has 2 CANS, Langa, there's a number of places that are organizing where people on the ground are saying things like, we've mapped in our area the most vulnerable households. The government's food parcels are not getting here. We need food. We need cash or we need food. Sort it out. And then people over here have given cash or given food. Now, a lot of that in some ways can be read as a purely welfarist liberal response. But what's been interesting is that between those, people who may not ordinarily have those conversations about privilege, about, the difference between structural change versus, an intervention in a crisis, are being exposed on certain platforms to those very discussions. Because one of the first things organizers in less resource communities did was say, okay, you all have with your bandwidth, send us money for data. We're going to have a meeting. We're going to have a Zoom meeting. We talk about the difference between collective organizing and welfarism. And we're going to have that chat at 8 in the morning and everybody needs to be there. And, not everybody was there, but people turned up. So whether that lasts is where I become a little more cynical. I'm not sure how much impetus this will have post a crisis. But there certainly are conversations that haven't happened for a long time across particular kind of divides in South Africa that are at least happening in some form. And that's a very small, and people literally count the number of sandwiches that are being given to people to stave off hunger, also for accountabilities, so that nobody's stealing money. So these are small things. These are not structural changes. But we know that some people are not starving as a result of this, and there are discussions going on at other levels. So on my good days, I'm like the portal and Arundhati Roy and the portal to the pandemic and a whole new world, and all my best love for science fiction feminists spills forth. On my worst days, when homeless people are put into essentially a concentration camp and picked up off the streets, and activists are shot, I'm like, it's just more of the same in a crisis context. So yeah, I suppose the only thing we'll know is in several years' time when we see what has or hasn't happened.
Thank you. And one very last question, and be just very short on that, because then we need to end. People are tired. Just from your very own perspective, Daniel, you already touched on that, like, what kind of activism would you focus on at the moment? Do you think it's more the time for national or even global scale, or would you rather say, let's focus on local struggles? Can you just sort of, in a nutshell, in 1 minute, what do you think, Daniel, would be most feasible?
Yeah, I mean, again, obviously, sort of my position, I think, is very much different than sort of Carla's and Blandine's position, because I'm speaking still as sort of an outsider. So obviously, I will not talk so much about sort of the national level and what can be done in China. I think what we should do and can do outside of China is to, as I said earlier, focus our energy on sort of establishing forms or platforms where activists in China and outside of China can share experiences. I think one of the biggest sort of tasks that we have is that, first of all, we need to ensure that those experiences by activists can be shared. We need also to ensure that we can highlight commonalities in struggles in different areas, right? So I think it's very important that sort of not only worker activists, but also feminist or LGBTQ activists, environmental activists in China and abroad can sort of sit together or talk online as we can do now, and exchange their experiences and their perspectives. I think this is a very this is our most important task. It's not something new. So comrades in Europe and in the US have been for a very long time obviously engaged in translation projects and in other attempts of online and offline platforms of bringing people together. But I think that we have to further these attempts and put some focus on bringing activists from inside and outside China together. There have been some specific examples. So if people want to look at what has been going on already, so at the end of January, for instance, there has been a very good and interesting forum meeting in New York that was called the China Question, where specifically the idea was to develop a leftist or radical leftist perspective on social struggles in China, but also on geopolitical relations from an activist's perspective. And I think that we should try and aim to set up something similar in Europe and for Europe activists as well. So this event in New York was still very much US China focused, but I think that we can also we should move beyond that and bring people in Europe also together with our friends and colleagues in China.
Thank you. And Blandine, what would you say? It's the local level, local struggles, national or even global cooperation. What would you focus on right now?
Well, in the People's Congress, Congreso de los Pueblos, as internationalists, we see that local, national, and global level are deeply linked, right? So we are really active in the territories, in our neighborhood, in the communities, indigenous movements, peasants movement, Black communities movement, but also we are articulated in the People's Congress nationally, and we're deeply involved in global proposal, because we think that this is the organizing on a local base that actually give you the tools to act globally. But definitely this is a moment in which we have to be looking to each other. We have to be talking to each other, exchanging ideas, challenges, critiques, self-critiques, and different kinds of perspective, because this is a moment of great opportunities. Like a few ones were mentioned by Carla earlier, but also that was 1 minute, but also for example, in the case of prisons, in the case of we can see how absurd those cage of people are. And so this is a great moment, for example, for feminist and abolitionist movement. For workers, this is a great moment in terms of we can see how absurd are the structure of the life of workers itself, and actually the absolute the fact that most of the works we do are useless and very few of them are actually useful. So maybe we could think about another society. So I think there's a lot of these things, and I'll take the occasion of your question to say something that's really important to me, is that we rely on a structure of internet that we think is free but is not. And so this is also a great time to think about our own structure in terms of popular movement on internet. And I'm talking about free software, open source software, and so forth, but also structures. Let's find cable, and if we need internet, well, then let's make our own. It won't be ready for next year, but maybe for the next pandemic or catastrophe or something like that.
Thank you. And you, Carla, what would be your goal? Local, national, or global?
So first of all, I really like the idea of internet, because the digital divide is an ongoing issue here around online teaching and education, as I'm sure it is elsewhere. Honestly, I think it depends on what people have energy for on any one day at the time. The struggles are long-standing and ongoing. People are going to start dying in a whole different kind of way. There's going to be caring and grieving that's going to need to be done in a whole different way, on a scale that we maybe haven't seen before for a while. So I think what we need to do is what we can, when we can, and where we have the most energy for that. The struggles are not going to disappear overnight because of a virus. They're going to possibly get worse. And what we need to do is to take care of each other and ourselves, because there's already going to be a lot of death coming. So, you know, to try and survive, get through this and do what we can when we can, as best we can, is about where my goals are right now. And whichever levels that is that people feel most, most able to assist at any particular point. So, yeah.
Thanks. Thank you. Thank you, all of us, for joining us and sharing the insight. And yeah, I see there's so many differences between the different contexts. China is a very different situation compared to Colombia, but I think it was really amazing how you all shared your context, and at the same time we found links between what we do and how we analyze. And thank you also for the technical support and everything. And this was the Corona Talk by the Interventionist Left. And we have the next Corona Talk next Sunday, and it's about anti-fascism and the question of like, what is actually the far right doing during Corona, and what are our anti-fascist answers to that? Thank you very much for listening.